make grinding palates, whilst the livelier silhouettes of ostrich, high-horned gazelle and ibex crowned some of the ivory pins and combs that were worn as dainty decorations in the hair. On rare occasions, as if in acknowledgement of their true origins, the pottery painters drew images of combs in short, sharp lines upon their red wash pots, beneath those of the silhouetted animals. It is unlikely, though ultimately unknowable, that these archetypal images were intended for the purposes to which they are usually assigned, that is, as the signs and symbols of some unspoken primitive anthropology. Some things, though, are certain. Drawn in outline on the pots, carved on occasion in glowing ivories in the most intractable of desert stones, both the subjects of the images and the materials from which they were made were the focus of intense scrutiny. A kind of meditation upon the world in which they lived, upon the rocks and clays and teeming wildlife of the lower Nile. It is as if the craftsmen had sensed the contradiction between the measured, cultivated world which they were creating and the world of which they were no longer part, that natural world of animals and plants and minerals. Sometimes, too, the pottery painters made little worlds within the pots they painted, a bowl decorated, perhaps, with zigzag watery lines across its center and a ring of clay model hippopotami running around its rim. In such designs there is much that harks back to the Merimdan cooking pot that was found filled with a trove of little objects, the ivory hippopotamus and the rest. This is true, not only of their subject matter but also in the patterns in which the potters set their images, in which usually divide the pot's round forms in the manner of a cross or clock or the weaving of a rush basket, that is to say, into radiating sections from the center in divisions of 4, 8 and 12. These little worlds are miniature versions of the Nile Valley. Usually, fishes, hippopotami and crocodiles are drawn in the lower sections of the vessel along with zigzag lines of water, whilst up above them and separated by triangles and horizontal lines, are images of land animals and people. One especially remarkable beaker has a lively group of model women set all around its rim, facing inwards and with every face and feature individually seen and drawn. The little group appears to be washing fabric together, at the river's bank, part filled with water. Such vessels would have portrayed the Naqada's Nile-side world with a striking miniature reality, the landscape of a snow globe in reverse. Other pots appear to have been designed as a single element within this reimagined world, swaying a little out of true like living palm trees. Some tall cylindrical vases are decorated with fronds around their upper sections, and the roots drawn along their bases are set in zigzag water lines. And all of these designs are based on the ingredients of life and landscape in the valley of the lower Nile, on water and the insistent linearity of the river and the cliffs. Unfortunately, there is no indication of what functions these fine pots may have originally performed. Certainly the images they hold were not considered as mere decorations, since the pigments that the painters used are friable and soft, and quite unsuitable for daily wear. Found both in settlement sites and cemeteries, they witness the beginning of a new phase of Nilotic prehistoric culture, one following the Faiyum farmers' absorption with the manipulation of the natural environment and the Badarians' elaborate arrangement of man-made objects within their cemeteries. For the early Naqadan potters had begun to manipulate images of both natural and man-made things and to place them one beside the other to create a pictorial equivalent of the world in which they lived. Settling and herding on her way down to the buried sand dune with its scattering of Badarian sherds, Kate and Thompson had excavated and removed the walls of 9 Naqadan huts. Modest circles made of wattle and daub, they are rare examples of their age and show that some of the early Naqadans were building in a manner similar to those of the Badarians. Set on a gravel bank high above the flood line, the 9 little circles, which are too small for homesteads, may have served as temporary shelters or as fuel and grain stores. And that in turn suggests that these early Naqadans moved as lightly on the earth as had their predecessors, traveling with their herds and returning to their crops at harvest time, with their occasional images of caravans of packed donkeys and drivers holding goads, with huts and marshlands and the ever-present river with its hippopotami and crocodiles and fish and boats. The white-lined images the Naqadans drew upon their pottery show us something of this living world, all set beneath the bordering mountains of the river's valley, and the wild animals on the plateau up above. Though some 60 Naqadan settlements have been located, few have yet been excavated, and our major source of information about the period still comes, as it did in the days of Flinders Petrie, from desert cemeteries, of which almost 100, large and small, have been located and from which some 16,000 burials have been recovered. Compared with those of earlier periods, the surviving relics of the Naqadan culture are the product of a completely different order of society. The numbers of the cemeteries and settlements, for example, are larger than those of all of their predecessors put together. They also span a longer period of time, virtually a millennium, and a far greater geographic spread. Though the earliest known Naqadan objects are the products of small communities similar to those of the Badarians, those of later periods belong to a craft culture that grew to span a near 600-mile stretch of the lower Nile, from close by the ancient Mediterranean coastline to the Nile's first cataract at modern-day Aswan, the town that is traditionally considered to be ancient Egypt's southern border. To that extent, at least, the Naqadan's relics are the first physical expression of a pan-Egyptian culture. Naqada, Abydos and Hierakonpolis. The modern town of Naqada and its prehistoric cemeteries lie 140 miles to the south of el-Badari, upon the river's western bank and at the point of sunset. Other settlements of similar antiquity stood a quarter of a mile away at the point of sunrise, on the river's other shore. Though they settled north and south along the river, the roots of this culture lay deep within the symmetric landscape where the enclosing valley bestowed on those who lived within it an innate sense of place and order, flow and rhythm, life and death. Naqadan culture appears to have had three main centers of production. Naqadan work flints, those most fundamental tools, show three distinct traditions, whilst the pottery also seems to share a similarly tripartite division, marked by differing qualities of line and subject matter in its painted imagery, along with regional preferences for specific shapes and forms. These three production centers roughly correspond to the sites of the three largest known concentrations of Naqadan cemeteries, which are usually assumed to have held the accumulated inhabitants of three nearby long-lived communities. The largest of these great burying grounds is close by Naqada, where Petrie excavated the graves of some 3,000 souls. A second lies some 70 miles downstream into the north of Naqada, at Abydos, where the first pharaohs would be buried, whilst the third lies a similar distance upstream, and to the south of Naqada, at a lonely west bank locality known now by its Greek name as Hierakonpolis, the city of the hawk. In Naqadan times, the high deserts were still not as desiccated as they are today, and people caravan with their animals, just as the Badarians had done, along the tracks that lead out from the plateaus above Naqada, Abydos and Hierakonpolis, through the Sahara to the western oases and eastwards also, through the Red Sea hills down to the coast, that the later Naqadan cemeteries at these three sites became so large may well signal the ending of the semi-nomadic existence and the beginnings of settled life within the valley of the Nile. Here, though, we are on the edge of speculation, for the settlements of the Naqadans are little known. Even those that are assumed to have had the largest populations, the prehistoric towns, perhaps, of ancient Naqada and Abydos, are largely unrecorded, and only small and mostly unrelated parts of Hierakonpolis, which appears to be the only large Naqadan site to have been preserved to any great extent, have yet been excavated. In all probability, however, there is now little left of these phantom towns, the best part of whatever there once was having been plowed up in desert reclamation schemes, or swept away down through the ages by the lateral movement of the river and its valley. Given these ambiguities, there yet remains the real possibility that there were never any urban Naqadan centers at all, and that the three great cemeteries marked the sites of gathering grounds, like those of the modern festivals of India. Whatever the ancient reality, recent archaeology at Hierakonpolis, in a 70-acre desert bay pocked by the moonlight craters of innumerable excavations, allows genuine glimpses of the Naqadan way of life. When the Naqadans first lived at Hierakonpolis, rainwaters from storms on the Sahara plains still sometimes flooded down the wadis to the Nile and greened the edges of the desert. And it was, perhaps, this greening that at around 3800 BC encouraged some early Naqadan herders to build sheds and corrals within the largest of these wadis, upon fans of rubble and sand brought down by ancient torrents. Here then, in this desert bay a mile and more behind the present line of fields, are the ruins of dung-filled stockyards and such vast amounts of animal remains that its excavators have suggested that the area may also have served as a slaughterhouse. And here too is a cemetery of impressive early Naqadan graves, each one set inside its own enclosure. Nearby, and marked now by the debris of generations in enormous heaps of slag and wasted sherds, there were groups of potters' workshops, whose kilns were often sited up above the level of the wadi floor, against the cliff, where they could take advantage of the evening breeze. Some of these studios, so their scattered debris shows, produced some of Naqada's finest wares. They also witnessed pottery making on an entirely different scale from anything that had gone before. In the 1970s, at the bottom of the wadi's wash, close to the modern fields, amongst the scrambled relics of a long-lived Naqadan settlement, an American expedition led by Michael Hoffman excavated the ruins of a potter's kiln, set on a circular platform some 16 feet across and made of mud. The kiln still held some fire bricks and the typical odd-shaped clay wasters that potters still make to support and protect their wares during firing. Early Naqadan pottery, so its physical analysis informs us, was fired at around 700 degrees Celsius, a temperature that could have been comfortably achieved by stacking a mass of fuel and fresh-made pots on this platform, by building a low wall around its edge and then covering it all up with mud and broken potsherds to contain the heat. Though modest in themselves, the skillful operation of such Naqadan kilns provides precise results. The Badarian potters, of course, had already mastered such techniques. And so, the potters knew that if the fire burnt too quickly and was too hot, the fabric of their pots would burst. That if, on the other hand, the fire was allowed to burn too slowly, it might not reach the temperature at which clay tempers to hardness. They also knew that if the logs of the fire were laid round the pots so as to allow a stream of clean air to rush around them during firing, they would obtain the rich colors typical of fine Naqada pottery. And that, on the other hand, if the kiln was densely packed and the fire controlled so that it stayed smoky during firing, the pots might turn completely black. Some Naqadan kilns, indeed, appear to have had a flue built into them, which could be partially closed or opened to control the updraft during firing. The mass of ancient sherds that lay all around this kiln, which Hoffman estimated at some 300,000 pieces, represented many years of pottery production. They also showed that this particular workshop had not made fine Naqadan ceramics but cooking pots, rough wares made from local clay tempered with chopped straw to protect them from bursting or breaking during firing. Close by this kiln, so close, in fact, that its excavators thought it likely that an overzealous firing had set it on fire, they found the ashy ruin of one of the few early Naqadan houses ever to have been excavated, the cinders, ironically preserving a date for its conflagration at around 3600 BC. Larger than the somewhat similar dwellings built at Merimda in the previous millennium, a single doorway gave access to a rectangular room some 12 feet long and 10 across, whose floor had been cut 2 feet into the surface of the desert, and whose walls were made of mud, plastered onto mats and wattle. A hearth on a mud plinth lay in a corner of the room. Close by, a storage pot had been set into The floor. The roof, which like the walls was made of mud and matting, had been supported on a row of posts some 5 feet high. Another row of posts outside the house suggests that it had also had a lean-to which, Hoffman proposed, had served as an animal pen. A Naqadan potter's model of a similar dwelling shows that such houses sometimes had windows set opposite their entrances which could have turned the building into a little wind tunnel and allowed the cooling evening breeze to refresh its dark interior with just the opening of the door. The model also shows that this single narrow entrance may have had a wooden lintel with a rolled-up mat hanging underneath that could be unrolled to close off its interior. This is the first known appearance of those so-called roll and lintel doorways that would be sculpted in their thousands in the rock architecture of ancient Egyptian tomb chapels during the following millennia. The model also suggests that house walls may have curved gently inwards, that the palms and rushes of the mats and wattle tended to bend under the weight of the mud plaster, giving it silhouette the distinctive sloping appearance of much later pharaonic architecture. Donkey bones found outside the house, within its lean-to, suggest that those enduring animals may have brought fuel for the kilns and carried away the potter's products in little caravans like those the white line painters sometimes drew upon their dishes. Caravans would certainly have been required to supply this gathering of pottery workshops in the desert wadis, which would have needed substantial supplies of fuel and clay and water to keep them in production. Why, then, were those workshops sited in such an inconvenient location? That parts of that same wide wadi house cemeteries, stockyards and slaughtering facilities suggest that some at least of these desert potters' workshops had been established to serve the needs of funerals, which, as the remnants of the cemetery's cooking hearths suggest, may well have been a time of feasting and meat-eating, just as it had been in the days of the Badarians. It is hardly surprising that the remains of brewing vats of this same period were found close by the potters' workshops. Along with baking, the activities of potting and brewing were interdependent throughout ancient Egyptian history. Bread makers required large numbers of pottery molds in which to bake their loaves. Brewers needed pots into which they could decant their brews. A well-preserved brewery, excavated in a settlement quite close to the potter's house, had consisted of at least 6 ceramic vats set in pairs upon a mud platform that to promote fermentation could have been covered over and heated in the manner of a potter's kiln, as well as the remains of dates and possibly of grapes within the vats, both of which would have provided extra sugar to the brew and aided its fermentation. The dregs contained remnants of emmer wheat, that fundamental element of the Neolithic revolution and the principal ingredient of ancient Egyptian beer. Each of the brewery's 6 vats, its excavators estimated, could have held some 16 gallons. This single establishment, therefore, may have produced around 300 gallons at a single 2-day brew, though if the beer had been siphoned into jugs immediately after its initial fermentation, as its excavators propose, that quantity would have been doubled. That other similar establishments, as yet largely unexcavated, appear to have been operating at this same time shows that brewing at Hierakonpolis was undertaken on a considerable scale. Though low in alcohol by modern standards, the product would at all events have had high nutritional value. Roughly contemporary with the potter's house, this brewery is one of the oldest known in all the world, another contender for that honor being a similar establishment excavated more than a century ago in the desert cemeteries of Abydos. Though further relics of these cottage industries have yet to be located. Outside Hierakonpolis, similar stockyards, breweries and potteries were undoubtedly established in the 3 main Naqadan centers and probably in other places too. At Abydos and Hierakonpolis, therefore, amidst the untidy sprawl of waste and ruin that is often found along the fringes of a desert, are the remnants of a social revolution. Large, single-purpose, specialized establishments operating in the first centuries of Naqadan culture, handling and producing far larger amounts of goods than their predecessors had ever done, replacing the smaller and more complex output of the Badarian communities. It was a redefinition of an ancient way of life, a change of scale and a new attitude to food procurement and production, part prompted perhaps by the arrival in the Nile Valley of a secondary wave of farming technologies that had been passing down through the Levant in earlier centuries and which now brought wine and figs and cheese into the settlements along the lower Nile, and perhaps had been the source of beer making as well. Nothing, though, is sure. Such archaeological ephemera as foodstuffs are erratically preserved and only the most modern methods of excavation and evaluation can accurately detect their presence. Nor is there anything to indicate the management systems that such enterprises as these early stockyards, potteries and breweries would have required. Nor, indeed, is there any evidence of trading systems, no budding capitalism. All that their relics show is that the hard life of the early farmers had eased, and that food surpluses were enabling some individuals within the early Naqadan communities to work at a range of specialized tasks outside those of subsistence farming. That there was, indeed, a growing communal wealth is also tokened by the increasing amounts of grave goods being placed in early Naqadan cemeteries. And it is this, perhaps, this changing way of life, that is also reflected in the white lines of the potters' decorations, as they dispassionately record the world around them, and identify their place within it. This growing sense of ease within the early Naqadan community is further evidenced by their extension of the traditional skills of animal husbandry. For now, along with such commonplace companions as dogs and domestic livestock, a variety of exotic animals, including hippopotami, wild cats and monkeys are buried in the larger cemeteries. The remains of 2 young African elephants are among the more bizarre relics of this bucolic husbandry, interred within the cemetery in the large wadi at Hierakonpolis. One of them, at least, appears to have been laid in a lavishly garlanded grave, dressed up in beads and linens in a manner similar to human burials, and accompanied by a clutch of white line bowls, some shining, black-topped beakers and some foreign pottery imported from the north. Nodules of red ochre and green malachite in a siltstone palette were also found within the tomb, to grind the elephant's cosmetics, dash and beads, and bracelets too, of amethyst, malachite and ivory, along with small stone mace heads similar to those carried by southern herdsmen, each weighing half a ton and standing 9 feet high. The 2 great beasts had probably been brought from a region south of the Nile's first cataract at modern-day Aswan. Both would have required 100 weight of fodder every day. One of them, so its stomach contents showed, had been fed on yellow water, flowers and rushes like those used for making baskets. That such enormous animals had been so well provisioned and so splendidly interred is further evidence, if it were needed, that the narrow greenhouse of the lower Nile was generating considerable agricultural surpluses. As a rule of thumb, it is generally assumed that early agricultural economies required at least 10 people working directly on the land to sustain one person engaged at other tasks like keeping elephants, making pots or brewing beer. There is no direct evidence, however, of how the early Naqadans produced such surpluses. Possibly, as we have seen, the secondary wave of food technologies that had permeated the Levantine farming communities had broadened the Naqadan stock and crop base, and the introduction of plows and the use of farm animals for traction had increased the size of a farmer's crop. In such circumstances, of course, the growing prosperity would also increase population levels, which in turn would have provided more manpower to colonize and farm the river's semi-wild valley. Such speculative economics, though, cannot account for the individual manner in which the Naqadans deployed and organized their growing resources, nor, indeed, for the elaborate culture which they were carefully creating. All that the preserving deserts show is that, a few centuries after the Badarian culture disappeared, some of the early Naqadans were running potteries, breweries and zoos and probably, on occasion, getting drunk as well. One wonders, therefore, what kind of society they were making. 6. a cloud across the moon. Death in Upper Egypt, 4000 to 3200 BC. Caveat emptor. Conventional histories of Naqadan culture are by definition bogus. The information fundamental to their compilation is simply not available. Basic statistics of Naqadan society are unknown. The roughest estimates of population and settlement size is little more than guesses. Nor did the Naqadans write. The very term prehistory, indeed, is popularly defined as those eras before the age of writing. There are no known events, no personalities, no cities, no wars, no clans, no cults, no evolutions and no revolutions. Traditionally, historians of Egyptian prehistory borrowed their narratives from classical literature and those of European scholars of the last few centuries. So the material cultures of the Badarians, the Naqadans or the Merimdans, are usually portrayed as the products of separate ethnic groups, the spread and influence of their pottery and other artifacts described in political or even military terms. Crudely, those with the fewest, or most primitive, possessions dash. The weak dash are invaded or colonized by the strong, and voila! Egypt is united. At first glance, the familiar language of such histories appears to reflect the natural order of the world. It is the same language, after all, in which the histories of the cultures of the three great Middle Eastern religions have traditionally been written, and it deals in the same passions and opinions, the same professions and offices of government, that compose our world today. Sadly, however, such Old Testament tales, as one historian describes them, obscure a strand of real history running through the relics of Naqadan society. For hindsight shows that something was taking place inside their riverside communities which in the course of the following millennium led to the creation, albeit the involuntary creation, of the first known literature, the first stone block architecture and the first state. The real fascination of this most ancient Egypt, then, its real history, is in tracing the slow development of all that, of the invention of Pharaoh's court and the idea of a state. And this, as recent evidence shows, was a process completely different from anything which traditional historians had previously described. For, though there are few hard statistics for the 4th millennium BC and known historical events, there is clear contemporary evidence of people making choices. The products of a century and more of excavation, for example, show that the Naqadans were engaged in developing a remarkable range of artifacts and techniques, everything from feeding bottles to stone block architecture. They also allow, as we have already seen, glimpses of the reality of life within some of the early Naqadan communities. And it is precisely this, the unique and innovative tenor of this society, which if you attempt to encompass it within the clichés of traditional histories will run through your fingers like desert sand. The Oval Court. In 1985, and with great good fortune, American archaeologists at Hierakonpolis discovered a location that gave an entirely new dimension to our vision of Naqadan society. Within the confines of a large and long-lived settlement spread across the bottom of the largest desert wadi, they uncovered an open area where, at around 3500 BC, the people of Hierakonpolis had laid out an oval courtyard, 100 feet and more in length, with a sloping, mud-plastered floor. Extended over several centuries, the courtyard had been enclosed with walls of mud and brick and stone, and all round its edges, represented by the merest ghosts of walls and post holes, the archaeologists discovered a unique group of buildings. A row of little workshops had been set down one side of the oval courtyard, where, as scatterings of flint tools and fragmented gemstones clearly showed, craftsmen had cut and polished carnelian and agate, obsidian and rock crystal. There were fragments too, of some splendid hard stone vessels and other well-made fragments of boxes or perhaps inlays for wooden furniture. Nearby, too, were the storerooms that had housed the craftsmen's raw materials. Here the archaeologists found slivers of lapis lazuli and ivory, malachite and turquoise, and shining desert stones, some of which had been brought from the most distant reaches of the ancient world. An enormous mass of sherds lay all around the courtyard, centuries of pottery, much of it scarcely used and then discarded, and some of it imported from the Levant and the Nile Delta, from Nubia and the oases of the Sahara. And there were local wares as well, some of them domestic. Some with white line decoration, and several in forms that were previously unknown that had been made, it would appear, for specific purposes. Along with these accumulated intimations of energy and rare things, the excavators found fragments and chippings in the oval court from the manufacture and sharpening of flint knives such as were used in slaughtering and butchering. Developed from Badarian forms, these elegantly curved broad-bladed knives, with sections as precise and slim as airfoils, were painstakingly produced by rubbing raw flint with abrasive dust down to the form required, which was then patterned with a final expert flaking and a virtuoso allusion to the ancient techniques of knapping stone. As sharp as cut-throat razors, the fragile blades of these fine knives are best suited to tasks requiring a deal of skill and care, shaped so that they could be grasped in 3 fingers with the index finger held straight along the back of the blade as if it were a pen. Some of these knives were designed to be used in an inward curving gesture, in acts of butchery, as later images suggest, like flaying, slitting and disarticulation. Judging from the considerable numbers of bones, shells and scales found in the long, deep trench which ran along one of the courtyard's sides, it would appear that those splendid knives had been made and used within the oval enclosure to butcher considerable numbers of animals, cattle, sheep and goats, gazelle and hares, and a wide variety of aquatica, turtles, crocodiles and catfish, as well as the gigantic perch that lurked in the depths of the Nile, along with the mass of pottery and the substantial quantities of bones of newborn lambs and other stock that farmers would usually have raised to adulthood. Such finds suggest that some of these acts of slaughtering and butchery were preludes to lavish feasts, occasions, it would appear, accompanied by the finest utensils that the Naqadans could manufacture. At all events, it appears that, in an era when the farmers of Hierakonpolis were producing food sufficient to support the potters and brewers in a desert wadi, and were maintaining considerable menageries, this oval court had served in some capacity within a Naqadan community as a locale for the conspicuous consumption of further agricultural surpluses. As its discoverer, Michael Hoffman, quickly recognized, there are direct links between this oval courtyard and some of the later architecture of Pharaonic Egypt. Directly opposite the courtyard's entrance, across its sloping pavement, Hoffman also uncovered the scanty ruin of a large 3-chambered building, with 4 enormous post holes set along its front, some 3 feet wide and almost 5 feet deep. These huge holes had been cut to house a row of massive pillars which, as the surviving remains of wood and bark suggest, may have been made from the trunks of conifers. Unlike the houses of the settlements, this had once been a considerable structure and of a type, apparently, that left a mark on the collective memory, for a building of the same dimensions with a similar row of massive pillars set along its high facade would be built almost a millennium later, in fine-cut blocks of stone, within the courtyard of the first Egyptian pyramid. Nor was this the only link between the Naqadan courtyard and Pharaonic Egypt. Both a mud brick platform built on the courtyard's floor close to its entrance and what appeared to be a socket dug for a single freestanding post, which had stood at the top end of the courtyard's slope, were reminiscent of the throne daces and the standards that appear in a series of miniature ivory engravings and small stone reliefs made centuries later in the times of the first pharaohs. These show the early pharaohs holding court, a correspondence further underlined by recent excavation in the oval court at Hierakonpolis of a cache of fine pottery dating from the time of the first pharaohs, which had been buried underneath its plaster floor. Some of the images on these engravings, therefore, show details of how such oval courts were used in later ages. Here then, are cattle corralled in low-walled oval enclosures, and what appear to be shrines, of a design similar to the enormous building whose scanty ruins Hoffman had found at Hierakonpolis, and whose forms would later be employed in several hieroglyphic images with connection to that same term. In many of these little scenes, the monarch sits enthroned upon a dais and people hold up standards all around him and overlook a series of presentations and slaughterings, activities that find obvious equivalents in the massive bone and pottery excavated at the Oval Court at Hierakonpolis. Continuing these comparisons, and with a remarkable consistency, some of these same small drawings suggest that the post hole at the center of the Hierakonpolis courtyard may well have held a mass bearing an image of one of the animals and birds that, later in Egyptian history, became the attributes of gods and kings, along with the tools of slaughtering and the accoutrements that would later decorate the pharaonic court. Such images may well have been made in the row of little workshops that once stood beside the Oval Court at Hierakonpolis. That many of the little ivory picture plaques from the time of the early kings have been found at various locations along the lower valley of the Nile suggests that such courtyard ceremonies were not reserved for Hierakonpolis alone, nor do the events that they portray seem to have been limited to a specific era, for in the 1990s excavations in Abydos Naqadan settlement close to Abydos yielded the remains of another slaughtering yard older and far smaller than that at Hierakonpolis, a yard that also held within it a wide range of ceramics and an exotic collection of butchered bone, the vague and ruined remnants, it would appear, of an earlier abattoir with direct links to the later court of Egypt. Great tombs. By itself alone, of course, the scanty ruin of a grand court at Hierakonpolis cannot demonstrate the presence of a prehistoric ruler in an early Naqadan settlement. At the same time, however, the organization required to establish and maintain such an elaborate establishment, and indeed, the near contemporary potteries, breweries and menageries, shows that some kind of management was operating within the settlements of the early Naqadan farmers, that the older, simpler and probably more egalitarian society of the Badarian villages had changed. Changes, too, had taken place within the cemeteries, where some graves were receiving far larger shares of their community's resources than others. Although the first known Naqadan burials in the cemeteries of Hierakonpolis, Naqada and Abydos, and in the smaller burying grounds, had held a relative equality of goods like the Badarian graves before them, substantial differences were starting to appear. Differences in the sizes and locations of the graves, in the quality and quantities of their grave goods, and even in the physical attributes of the people interred are all to be found in these different burials. Hierakonpolis once again provides the best examples of these changes. Plausito the Wadi potteries, and scoured by both ancient floods and 19th century plunderers, faint traces have recently been uncovered by archaeologists of a dozen of the largest known graves of the early Naqadan period, the remnants of substantial brick-lined rectangles up to 20 feet in length set together in a separate cemetery accompanied by an extraordinary mix of animal burials, the 2 young elephants, a wild ox, an aurochs, a similar bovine that is now extinct, some dogs and cats, baboons and cows. Each of these great graves had been enclosed in walls of matting, mud and wicker, marking generous rectangles some 60 feet and more in length upon the desert's crust. Some of these enclosures appear to have contained rows of wooden posts, and a life-size limestone statue of a human figure also seems to have been set up in what, from its scant remains, appears to have been a shelter dash. Or perhaps, the oldest known tomb chapel in all of Egypt's history. The first of a mighty line of Egyptian images of stone, the statue had been rendered into hundreds of small fragments, so that it is presently impossible to determine even whether the figure had been standing up or sitting down. Pieces of its nose and ears, however, show that it was a work of considerable craftsmanship, sculpted with the precision of the Naqadan's miniature animal sculptures and with a sense of form similar to that of better preserved examples made in the following centuries. Its reconstruction, therefore, would reconstitute a milestone in world art. Pieces of at least 4 life-size ceramic masks were also recovered from this devastated burial ground, reminiscent of contemporary Levantine works and, like the little head from Merimda, designed around a single central point, there. Alien gaze jolts us into remembering that the world in which these things were made was very far from Pharaoh. Though fragments of flashing Afghan lapis, of obsidian brought perhaps from Chad or Ethiopia, some prettily made flints and tiny flakes of gold and silver from the ruined tombs, and at treasures as finely wrought as those of the later kings, the familiar style of ancient Egypt had not yet been constructed when these great tombs were set down on the desert. Nor do we know anything of the objects from which the greater part of these fragments came, nor anything, indeed, of the people in whose tombs these mysterious objects appeared to have been placed. Clearly, however, the burials in this isolated cemetery were the recipients of considerable quantities of their community's resources, people whose menageries devoured part of its agricultural surpluses and whose burial suites had held the best of its craft production. Judging from the bone fragments, a minimum of 16 people were interred in those graves, and several, it appears, in a single tomb. The partial remains of 2 girls and a young man, for example, were found thrown into the corner of one of the great burial pits. Such practices were also common in contemporary graves of similar size in the cemeteries of Abydos and Naqada, where the early excavators found as many as 5 individuals curled up together. Only the bones from the great early Naqadan cemetery at Hierakonpolis, however, have been examined by modern pathologists, who found that this group of people had smaller muscle attachments than those of their contemporaries who had been buried in smaller and less well-provided tombs. The people buried in the Wadi cemetery by Hierakonpolis, therefore, had not engaged in the manual labor common to agrarian societies, but lived a life apart. Here, then, is the rub. Once archaeologists recognized that the Naqadans had begun to separate the communality of the earlier cemeteries into different types of grave that could be conveniently described as rich or poor, elite or working class. It was but a short step to create a sociology for the Naqadans, based on the words used to describe their different tomb types, and thus to bestow a kind of history on their graves. For the modern meaning of elite signifies those considered to be the best in their society because of their power, talent, or wealth. And so this Naqadan elite is easily portrayed as a class endowed with power and wealth, and as the conduit of social and economic progress. So with passing time, the term elite has allowed the occupants of those tombs upon whom it is bestowed to assume a kind of personality. Just as a common Western notion of an individual is of a man who rules himself, so the bones and fragments found within the elite tombs have come to occupy successively the role of chief, then local ruler, and finally transmogrified to pharaoh. So kings are crowned, the past is colonized, and history becomes a soap opera, or at least it is transported into a universe where great tombs are jargonized as examples of the conspicuous consumption of prestige commodities by an elite, and ostrich eggs are status symbols, harpoon points, power facts, and those tiny fragments of Afghan lapis flashing in the sand, evidence that their owners once dominated by the political advantage gained through exercising control over access to resources that can only be obtained through external trade. That, though, is just a history of consumer trends dressed up as old-fashioned anthropology. For there is no evidence whatever of militarism, politics, or individuals at Hierakonpolis, nor even of a grand bureaucracy amongst the relics of the early Naqadans. No evidence, either, of commercial trade or of a Naqadan conception of ownership. Terms such as rich and poor, therefore, may be inappropriate. And yet there is still a history to be made of this most distant age, a history that is not based on modern society, but on the certainty of what survives, skillfully excavated by an American-led expedition at the turn of the millennium, a well-preserved example of Hierakonpolis' more modest cemeteries that had been part contemporary to the great tombs in the desert Wadi once lay at the edge of the large settlement in which the oval court had stood. Though heavily plundered, its 460-odd surviving graves held the remains of some 500 people who might have attended activities at the Oval Court when it was in its heyday. A careful study of their bones shows that, in common with similar burials in other cemeteries, this section of the early Naqadan population of Hierakonpolis had been healthy and robust, enjoyed a balanced diet, suffered some of the common afflictions of humanity and lived on average for some 50 years. The same study also showed that, though these people had worked hard all their lives, they had not worked excessively, as has so often been the case in more recent times, whilst the low rates of healed fractures suggested that their labors had not been very dangerous. The fine white sand in which these modest burials were laid preserved their linen burial cloths along with the baskets and matting that were sometimes used as covering, as in all prehistoric Nile-side cemeteries. Pottery too was a constant accompaniment. One of the less disturbed graves, a burial of a middle-aged woman, still held 7 vessels, only one of which was of the elegant polished pottery that has become the modern emblem of Naqadan culture. Most of her burial wares, however, were cooking pots and rough domestic pottery, some of which showed signs of daily use and marks of mending. That some of these pots contained the remains of beer or ashes suggested they had been used for the last time at her funerary feast. As for her corpse, though partially robbed, in common with those of the other graves, the desiccating sand had given her, as it had the other burials, the eeriness of natural mummification. There appears to have been an equitable mix of men and women within this cemetery, and both sexes seem to have been buried with similar quantities of grave goods. Only the men, however, appear to have been equipped with knives. As if in further confirmation of such Neolithic work divisions, a few women had been given little bags of cooking herbs and garlic. Some of these people had straight hair, others curly. Some had used henna dye in hairpieces. Rarely, for most of the metal had been taken from these burials, a few copper needles yet remain in some of the graves, a small chisel, some simple jewelry, a comb with some missing teeth. The body's stomach contents showed that some of these people had eaten various forms of cereals. One had died in the heat before the annual flood, for he had just eaten the ripened seeds of desert melons. Infants, though, had been given special baby food, from which the indigestible emmer chaff had been carefully removed. But there were few children in this cemetery. Given the high infant mortality rates of ancient times, it would appear that, like other contemporary Nile-side communities, the early Naqadans of Hierakonpolis had buried their tiny corpses close to their houses, by the hearth. As in other graveyards of the period, some of the bodies in the cemetery had been part dismembered, heads and legs removed and replaced sometimes by pots and sticks and baskets. Such mutilations had been found in the Naqadan cemeteries of Upper Egypt since the earliest days of excavation, when European archaeologists, who considered the Naqadans to be primitive, had taken it as evidence of cannibalism. There is no evidence, however, that body parts were ever cooked or eaten. Some of these graves contained elaborate and individual patterns composed of pottery and flints and cosmetic palettes as well as portions of dismembered bodies. This has suggested to more modern-minded archaeologists that these arrangements were continuations of the Badarians. Elaborate funerals, in which the processes of individually defining each and every corpse at time of burial had taken what must surely have been a dramatic and necessarily emotive turn. Nor was this the only evidence of human butchery within the cemetery. There was unique evidence, as well, of other, yet more macabre, practices. Masses of small cuts on some of the skulls show that several people had been expertly scalped, while damage to others showed that their owners had been brutally bludgeoned to death. The skulls that showed signs of scalping had belonged to men aged between 18 and 30, tracing an elaborate series of cuts across the forehead and round the side of their heads. Knife marks left on the bone show that the cuts would have allowed the hair and scalp to have been pulled away from the head. as one might remove a bathing cap. Some of these same heads had also been most expertly butchered, to remove them from their bodies. The people who were bludgeoned to death had been struck by objects directed with such force that some of the skulls had shattered like teacups. Others, however, had survived just such attacks. One girl, for example, had suffered a brutal crack to the head as a child and her skull had almost healed before she died in early adulthood. 5 other people, though, had each been killed with one swift blow. One of these, a woman in her late 30s, had already sustained a broken arm, while a younger man, who had earlier suffered fractures of a rib and wrist and who also had a well-healed depression in his skull from an earlier blow, had finally succumbed to a hit so powerful that it had sent fragments of his skull deep into his brain, from where a paleopathologist would eventually retrieve them. These blows were to the back or sides of the skull, and the wounds that they had left were consistent with those produced by rounded small stone maces such as are not uncommon in contemporary male graves. Most of the aggressors appear to have been right-handed, and the position of their strikes suggests that the hair on the top of the victims' heads may have been held to steady the blow. Just as with the nearby Oval Court, there is later pictorial evidence of such events. Drawings and reliefs from the earliest dynasties of kings show 2 people locked in exactly the same deadly pose. A white-lined vase found in the Abydos Cemeteries, a near contemporary of the slaughtered bodies buried at Hierakonpolis, holds images of 2 bound men joined by a rope, being led by a third and larger figure who holds a mace in his right hand, whilst other fragmentary white-lined images seem to show similar scenes of violence and captivity. Though scalped and smitten, the victims found in the Hierakonpolis cemetery appear to have received a normal burial. One young man who had been maced to death was carefully interred as part of a double burial. A woman whose skull had been similarly smashed had been laid down so that the wound was out of sight, and her thick dark hair had been arranged across her face, away from the mass of blood and bone behind. Neither abused, nor shunned, nor cast away. Such tender burials do not fit the traditional historian's category of victim, nor indeed do such burials in themselves show evidence of prehistoric savagery, let alone cannibalism. Nonetheless, the ancestors of Pharaoh, whose culture is popularly associated with beauty, flowers and love songs, appear to have engaged in the brutal execution of some of their own people. Such acts, indeed, became a central image of pharaonic Egypt. Precisely the same cruel practices are pictured in some of the little drawings made in the age of the first kings, images that would be writ large throughout the following millennia on temple pylons, where Pharaoh smites his enemies by grabbing them by their hair and hitting the side of their heads with the same kind of mace which had done such damage to those poor Naqadans buried in a cemetery at Hierakonpolis. That killings may have been conducted in early Naqadan times on a yet larger scale than the bodies in the cemetery suggest finds confirmation in the shape of a solitary human neck vertebra excavated inside the enclosure of one of the great tombs at Hierakonpolis. It bears the marks of a beheading that took place just before or shortly after death. Such a killing presages arrangements made half a millennium later at the tombs of Egypt's first kings, where each royal vault would be surrounded by rows of modest, brick-lined graves like the cells of a honeycomb, each one specially designed, it would appear, to hold a victim dispatched at the time of the royal funeral. Some of the same little drawings that record events in and around the early courts also hold scenes which show people being violently attacked and sometimes decapitated, and publicly displayed, and they appear to show this taking place in the presence of a king. One particularly violent tableau shows 2 seated figures who appear to have been partially scalped, their hair dropping down across their faces, their skulls above left round and bare. And of course, although the animals in these same small pictures are shown running free inside an oval courtyard, the physical remains at Hierakonpolis show that, in reality, the oval court had served as an abattoir, the artificially sloping floor a drain for running blood. like the moment at the beginning of Buñuel's famous film where a cloud slides across the moon and a razor runs through a woman's eye, the physical evidence of such events cuts us adrift from the pretty clichés of pharaonic history, and suddenly, we are in another world. Who was it, then, who oversaw and undertook such brutal and benign activities as are witnessed by the bodies in these cemeteries? What really shaped and ordered this society? Michael Hoffman once observed that the sheer volume of pottery that yet survives at Hierakonpolis, Naqada and Abydos suggests that those settlements had been controlled by potters who had risen to preeminence during the exportation of their celebrated wares, black-topped, white-lined, to communities up and down the river. This would suggest a situation similar to that of the salt miners of Bronze Age Hallstatt in Austria, who became so rich by pickling pork and exporting hams across the Alps that they went to work dressed up in Chinese silks and were buried with the considerable accoutrements of European Bronze Age warriors. The early Naqadan potters, on the other hand, appear to have been subsidized by the growing surpluses of farming. The most plausible explanation of the dozens of small Naqadan cemeteries up and down the Nile which were once filled with just such wares is that they were composed of the graves of farming communities who had obtained such fine pottery through processes of exchange. This, however, tells us nothing about the situation of the people buried in the various cemeteries, grand and modest, of Naqada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis. Are they also the graves of farmers, master potters and laborers? Or are they, as traditionalists assume, the various burying grounds of nearby communities, which were the size of towns and cities? Were these pottery manufactories and cattle markets operating under the aegis of an elite buried in the most opulent of their desert cemeteries and who had sanctioned acts of violence such as have been so vividly preserved at Hierakonpolis and which were undertaken as demonstrations of their civic power? Yet there is no evidence that the cemeteries of Naqada, Hierakonpolis and Abydos served three great principalities, let alone that their burying grounds marked the resting places of urban despots and their subjects. They may just as well have contained the relics of entirely different systems of order and obligation, the residues, perhaps, of pilgrimage centers and their attendant industries, with the great, grand cemeteries holding the graves of sages, celebrants or officials, such as developed in the time of Pharaoh around the prehistoric cemeteries of Abydos. Alternatively, these cemeterial conurbations could be the residues of more complex social structures, which like the relics of some near-contemporary Mesopotamian societies, may have been made up of groups of semi-interdependent household units, each one with its own head of family and its own centers of production and consumption, its own potteries and graveyards, granaries, storerooms, workshops and slaughtering yards. And each one of these, as the remains in the nearby deserts might suggest, held flocks of animals whose herders, as in many Middle Eastern communities today, were semi-mobile pastoralists living between the settlements and the plains. As to the evidence of some kind of progress towards the unification of the land we now call Egypt and the formation of the pharaonic state, the sole surviving witnesses are the bodies in these enigmatic cemeteries and the things made within the living communities. And these show that the greatest changes, and, perhaps, the greatest contemporary excitements were the Naqadans. Continuing elaborations of the processes of the so-called Neolithic revolution, the processes, that is, of the domestication, not only of animals or plants, but of their cultivators also. For certainly the role that the domestic crafts and active burial had played in earlier societies, their role in the affirmation of both the individual and the community in which they lived, was greatly changed. Farmers and herders now formed part of a wider community in which everyday goods were increasingly made by specialists. Work itself, and the things that it produced, had both become commodities. At the same time too, the relics also show that some of the settlements were growing in size, prosperity and social complexity. The relative egalitarianism of the earlier farming communities, which had been small enough to allow social interaction between all their members, had been transformed. The mass of people buried at Naqada, Abydos and Hierakonpolis were undergoing such extraordinary stress as found expression in the swinging of a deadly mace, and the establishment of public slaughtering yards designed to drain the running blood into a bone-filled trench. 7. Boats and donkeys. Copper, trade and influence within the lower Nile Valley, 3500 to 3000 BC. Halfway through the 4th millennium BC, riding gently on the prehistoric river, a fleet of painted boats slides slowly into view. It is the oldest known wall painting in Egypt, and one of its greatest fascinations is that it holds within it elements which, magnified and smoothed, will become some of ancient Egypt's central and most celebrated images. The sunken burial chamber that held this prehistoric painting was similar in size and construction to those of the great graves at Hierakonpolis within the Wadi cemetery that lay a mile away from it, and which appeared to have been abandoned before the painted tomb was made. Situated at the edge of the sprawling settlement that held the oval court and close to the cemetery of working people, with its scalped and executed bodies, it was one of a group of similar, though unpainted tomb chambers that together comprised a small select cemetery. Unlike the earlier tombs within the desert wadi, however, none of the superstructures of these tombs are known. There are few records of the hurried excavation of the painted tomb, which took place in the winter of 1898, following its plundering by antiquities dealers. Since that time, as well, the tomb itself has entirely vanished, the fragile mud brick wall on which the boats were drawn either covered by drifted sand or lost to a land reclamation scheme, along with a few sad fragments, dark with varnish, that are exhibited in the Cairo Museum. Only a watercolor copy of the lost original has survived. When it had first been found, however, the painting was bright and well preserved. The long wall on which the boats were painted had been prepared with a 1/4 inch of yellow desert plaster that to modern eyes had given the painted images the unity of a single composition. Set some 5 feet down into the desert floor, the rectangular burial chamber in which the painting had stood was about 19 feet in length and 9 feet wide, and a cross wall with some human figures drawn upon it had part divided it into 2 near squares. The 6 boats were painted along the full length of the chamber's western wall in 2 horizontal lines, 2 boats above and 4 below. 5 white vessels and 1 odd black one, which was placed at the center of the wall, and which had a shape like a stack of tied-cut reeds at its stern that rose up higher than the level of the other boats and was set beside a steering oar. Though several of the boats had cabins and figures on their decks, none of them had sails or rowing oars. They simply floated on the wall as they would have done upon the river's stream. Their images, indeed, were literally headed northwards, in the same direction as the river Nile that lay just a few hundred feet away from them. 20 groups of little figures were painted all around the boats, images of the hunters and the hunted, of humans and their weapons, animals hobbled and entrapped. Some of these images were drawn in the distinctive manner of the pottery painters. At the wall's top edge, for example, 4 ibex ran along a common baseline. Many of the groups, however, had been composed and drawn in different and quite novel ways. A standing man heraldically supporting 2 posing lions, 2 elaborately costumed figures who faced each other and appeared to either dance or fight, and, in the oldest known example of an Egyptian smiting scene, a figure held a rope to which 3 tethered people were attached, and he was clubbing them. Some of the images in the painting, therefore, were part of the traditional Naqadan repertoire, others were quite novel, and many survived to become core ingredients of the pharaonic arts. The tomb chamber, a graphic link between prehistory and the pharaonic state, for more than 60 years after its discovery. However, there was no agreement even as to its date, for its excavators had not published a detailed account of their work, and so the surviving bits and pieces from the burial could not be fitted into Petrie's sequence dating system. In different histories, therefore, the date of this extraordinary painting had fluctuated by several centuries. Was it really as old as the similar images of the early Naqadan pottery painters suggested, or was it merely a product of a provincial time lag, made at a time when such images as pharaoh smiting captives were common currency throughout the land? Was it, indeed, a tomb at all? No fragments of a corpse appeared to have been found in it. Guy Brunton, who had visited the open tomb whilst excavating at Badari, had thought it to be a foreign shrine, one made perhaps by maritime invaders. In the 1960s, and for the first time, a list of the excavated contents of the painted tomb was published, that had been gleaned from one of the archaeologists' rediscovered field notes, along with some damaged photographic negatives, long forgotten in an English loft. These showed that the painted chamber was indeed a tomb, and of a distinctive type that was also to be found in similar small cemeteries at Abydos and Naqada, give or take a century or so. All of these great tombs had been made in the middle of the 4th millennium BC. The remaining fragments of the burial goods found in the painted tomb were those of an opulent interment, whilst the piles of ash and pottery which had lain round the chamber walls suggested that a meal had been cooked at the time of the funeral, in the traditional manner. Comparisons with similar graves in other cemeteries showed that the burial had probably lain in the half of the divided tomb that the tomb's robbers had completely emptied. These comparisons also suggested that the painted tomb may well have held more than one corpse and that some of them were probably dismembered. Beside the corpses, the crypt had probably contained mats and cloth, some boxes and simple coffins and some jewelry too, perhaps of metal, lapis lazuli and other semi-precious stones. Quantities of pottery and provisions, including jars of fat and chunks of slaughtered oxen, were probably buried in the tomb as well, along with linens and cosmetic palettes and the necessary pigments, some fine stone vases, pretty pins and combs of ivory, some copper objects, harpoon heads and fish hooks, and some fine flint knives. Of all the known tombs of this type, however, only this single tomb at Hierakonpolis had a painting preserved upon its walls, an outlandish mix of imagery which tells us that life within the Naqadan settlements was changing yet again, and that another and quite different era was already underway. What then, exactly, did the painting represent? At first glance, both the yellow plaster of the painting's ground and the line along the bottom of the wall gave its images a unity and direction that suggests they shared a single subject. Was it, perhaps, a flotilla of boats passing by various bankside activities? Was it a pleasure cruise? A trading trip? A raiding party? A royal visit, even, or a funeral? Such questions easily arise when we view the painting as a line drawing in a book, as our eyes search for clues amidst the printed lines, reducing the intrinsic qualities of an ancient 16-foot mural to an inky modern-day aesthetic, transforming a painting's brush marks to tiny symbols on a page and then puzzling over their iconography and purposes, easily translates ancient reality into a mirror of our own preoccupations. How, then, may we retrieve something of this painting's original plan and purposes? First, perhaps, by questioning the way we involuntarily read such images at all, for certainly there is no reason whatever to suppose that their makers intended them to be read by eyes trained to read lines of text, or photographs, or paintings with pictorial perspective. These ancient images, therefore, may not hold a unity in the narrative manner of a traditional European painting. They might not be a picture in that sense at all. They may not have been intended to portray an event nor even to hold symbolic meaning. Alternatively, the wall might hold narratives we simply cannot see, or then again, the relationships that we can perceive between these images may be as incidental as those between different animal species corralled within a single space, one of insouciant indifference. In short, there is no way of even knowing if this wall held images of one boat shown in several different guises, or a fleet of boats together, all riding on the river's flow. Some things, though, are certain. Every one of the painting's 6 great boats was drawn at a height convenient for a standing person walking up and down the wall, and the swinging shapes of their hulls echo a gesture of a human arm. Of themselves alone, such generous brush strokes show a confidence of attack, a habit of such work. They show, as well, an awareness of the scale and placement of each separate vessel, which were all set in careful relationship one to the other, right along the wall. These boats also appear to have been painted at the beginning of the work, while the little groups of animals and people were added later and mostly, it appears, in a fairly random manner. These secondary images, moreover, show a number of quite different hands at work. The line of 4 running ibex and some of the other beasts are fluidly drawn in the practiced manner of the pottery painters, as are the 6 great boats, with careful emphasis on their silhouettes. In contrast, the brushwork of some of the other little groups, the man with the 2 opposing lions, the 2 facing figures, the group with the smiting man, is unskilled and untrained. At the same time though, the consistency of the tony and textures of the pigments that the various painters used, black, white and red, still visible on its surviving fragments, appear to have been used right across the wall. This would suggest that all those images had been painted in a single session, in a single period of time. And that in turn suggests the moment of the ancient funeral, when, in the manner of the ancestors, the open grave would have served as a theater for the deposition of the dead and for sacrifice and feasting. In all likelihood, therefore, the images were drawn by some of the participants in this ancient drama as a further individuation of the person being buried. Perhaps the various hands that drew the smaller images were marking some kind of communal or familial affinity with the person or persons being buried in the tomb. Perhaps they had made their marks upon the wall painting before the burial was closed and when the master painter's fresh ground pigments were still within the open tomb. Boats and pots. Whoever the draftsman may have been, the type of boat they drew within the painted tomb of Hierakonpolis had brought about a fundamental transformation amongst the people of the Lower Nile. Older images already show that the felicitous combination of the rivers south-north flow in a directly opposing wind had long since encouraged the use of oars and sails upon the great wide waterway, just as is shown within the painted tomb, and certainly they picture craft of similarly curved design. Such boats, however, were probably made of bundled reeds all held together by a single tensioning rope, craft that, as Thor Heyerdahl would discover, have limited life and load capacity. The images in the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis, however, show boats that, whilst they sport the traditional up-curving prow and stern, had been dramatically enlarged and strengthened to enable them to accommodate passengers and cabins, decks and crews. And this in turn shows that by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, at the time the tomb was made and painted, the Naqadans were building boats of similar size and shape to those of latter eras that have survived, and which are made of planks of wood. So, though there are many other undated and perhaps earlier rock engravings of similarly large boats, some of which have sails and banks of roan oars, the unique tomb painting at Hierakonpolis has fixed their introduction into a specific era of Naqadan culture. Such boats would have had an extraordinary effect, just as the railways open up the world to 19th century Westerners and as satellites would change the horizons of following generations, so these large wooden barks with crews and cabins had revolutionized the role of traffic on the Nile and life in the Nile-side communities. At the same time, they were also a tangible exemplar of how the Nile-side settlements might be joined together as a single entity, for images of their swinging hulls and other accoutrements came to embody some of the earliest aspects of pharaonic government. At the same time that the painted tomb was made, the Naqadans were also painting images of big boats with cabins upon a brand new range of pottery, drawing their distinctive swinging hulls and soft brush lines of dark red pigment on the surfaces of a new, light-colored, unburnished terracotta made from a newly developed clay of marl and shales that had been quarried in desert wadis close to Naqada. Although the earlier white-lined wares were no longer made, this new generation of pottery painters still use many of their traditional graphic devices. And they still arrange the images they painted on their pots as miniature Nileside universes complete within themselves. Now, though, they strung rhythmic images of several boats all around the outside of a range of generously rotund vessels. And, like the boats drawn in the painted tomb, these boats painted on the newly developed pots might also be accompanied by images of animals and plants and people, set within the traditional linear devices of lines and triangles that echoed the narrow landscape of the river valley through which the boats were sailing. Now, too, the Naqadan's boats appear to have been sailing further than they had done before. In early Naqadan times, the northernmost Naqadan communities appear to have lived close to Badari, while the southern limits of the culture lay 250 miles upstream and south of Hierakonpolis, where some of the desert cemeteries held not only Naqadan graves but those of the southern herders, whose largest cemeteries were further up the Nile, in Nubia and far beyond. By the middle of the millennium, however, the Naqadan's red-painted buffalo pots were appearing in cemeteries and settlements all along the lower Nile. It is this that signals the ending of the first phase of Naqadan culture and the beginning of another era of prehistory. And for the first time, the geographic spread of this new Naqadan pottery marks out the full extent of the later pharaonic state. Like the Naqadan's wooden boats, their new pots were a considerable technical achievement. Unlike the earlier and darker traditional wares which had been made from Nile silts, the shale-based clays from which the new buffware was made could be fired at higher temperatures, which made their fabric stronger and thus encouraged the potters to make thinner, lighter and larger vessels. At this same time too, the potters had developed such a precise control over their kilns that, though the fabric of the new pots was fired at higher temperatures, they were not heated to the point of vitrification, which would have rendered them impervious. So when these new thin wares were filled with water, they sweated sufficiently to allow a gentle evaporation from their surfaces, and, thus, the cooling of their contents. So the potters' red-painted boats sailed on far cooler waters than before, and for the first time, too, the Naqadans made pigments that were insoluble and impervious to wear. Not that the Naqadan potteries limited the forms of their new wares to water jars. Some of the handsome forms of hard stone jars were now replicated in the light buff clay and decorated with clever, dull red designs based on the natural patterning of stone, and some of these vessels were given stout handles so that they could be hung. Other more utilitarian wares had protective strips of clay attached to their rounded forms, a device copied from Levantine studios. Prettily notched by the opposing pressure of a potter's fingertips and set like wavy handles on the swelling pots, these reinforcements served as grips and allowed the vessels to be packed side by side with less risk of breakage. It is difficult to imagine that such practical and striking pottery was unappreciated by the Naqadan's contemporaries to the north and south. The excavated evidence, indeed, shows the extent and swiftness of their spread. And, of course, these Nileside neighbors lived in the same universe as the Naqadans, and shared the same distinct experience of the great wide river as the pottery painters, the high proud boats, the fringing cliffs, the desert animals beyond, as well as the swinging shapes of Nile barks and the endless horizontals of the valley landscape. The Buffer potters also used simple patterns in polka dots or wavy lines, or, still more simply, a potter might dip 3 fingertips into his pot of pigment and, with considerable panache, simply touch the surface of the pot in small curved strokes. Despite such sophistications, however, there is a novel air of haste in all of this. Even the most elaborate of these maroon decorations are but reworkings of a dozen stock graphic elements, whilst the range of the potter's forms was less varied than those of earlier times. In considerable contrast to the earlier, jewel-like, white-lined wares, these dull red-painted pots are the clear outcome of a kind of mass production. Such processes had started with the establishment of purpose-built desert potteries. such as have been found at Abydos and Hierakonpolis. At first, such potteries might possibly have been operated by part-time farmers. Yet the large numbers of pots that the early Naqadan kilns came to produce, the lengthy preparation of the clay that such work requires, the gathering of fuel to fire the kilns and the act of potting of itself, let alone the distribution of such a mass of pots, could hardly have been undertaken, or would, indeed, have been required by a family of farmers. Here, then, the millennial life ways of the farming settlements had already broken down into different abstract zones of work. A communal redistribution of labor and resources within the Naqadan settlements that had long been underway before the decorated buffware was developed. Apart from the tremendous mass of broken sherds that yet survive, some 500 complete examples of maroon decorated buffware pottery have so far been found in excavations from Nubia to the Nile Delta, along with some rather wobbly local copies that underline the extent and impact of their popularity with the complement of imitation. These pots, it would appear, were trafficked if not traded up and down the river and in considerable quantities. This, then, is the beginning of a process part pictured on the buffware pots themselves, as well as in the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis, a process, one might term it, of riverization, the early stages of the creation of a Naqadan sphere of operations that would come to stretch from Aswan to the Nile Delta. It was, as well, the beginning of the transformation of settlements up and down the Nile, from small-scale subsistence economies to an Egypt-wide commodification of goods and food, labor and production, that would become the model for the supply chains which supported both the building of the Great Pyramids and the statewide systems of collection and supply that were the economic backbone of pharaonic Egypt. The changing uses of the Great River may also be an underlying reason for the population movements which also took place at this time. Some of the older Naqadan settlements that had been set along the fringes of the desert appear to have been abandoned, whilst others set closer to the river underwent considerable enlargement. At Hierakonpolis, the location of the painted tomb, at the edge of the prehistoric settlement beside the oval court and a mile away from the earlier great tombs in the wadi, appears as part of this same trend, nothing less than a refocusing of communal life within the Naqadan heartlands. Such population movements may also have been part prompted by the gradual shifting of the river ever eastwards on its bed, just as it would continue to do throughout the course of ancient history. It may also have been a product of an increasing aridity of the valley's fragile micro-deserts. The impact, perhaps, of the Naqadan cattle stations, breweries and potters' workshops on the valley's ecosystem that prompted a move away from herding and corralling at the desert's edges towards the river and its boat landings, and an increasing preoccupation with trade and water traffic testified by the wide distribution of the buffware pots and the appearance of images of wooden boats within the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis. Such terms as trade, however, must be used with considerable care. Like the Naqadan elite, the modern connotations of such words constrict their ancient understanding. By itself, of course, the term need not be trade in either the Scottish or the English meanings that De Quincey so carefully distinguished in these chapters epigraph. It need not, for example, signal either a desire for profit, or prestige, or even individual initiative. Nonetheless, there is real evidence that some form of prehistoric trading, or, at least, a cultural symbiosis, had been in operation since the times of the White Line painters, a flow of goods between the settlements along the Great Wide River and, most significantly, between some of the northern Nilotic settlements, with whom the Naqadans appear to have been trading, and the peoples of the South Levant, Madi Budo, import-export. The best known of the northern Nile side communities with proven connections with the South Levant was the prehistoric settlement known now as Madi, after the Cairo suburb in which it is presently situated. Like its long-defunct predecessor at Merimda 40 miles to the north, the settlement at Madi was very large and was built upon a fan of Wadi silt. extensively excavated from the 1930s by successive teams of Egyptian archaeologists. Mahdi, it appears, had been founded as early as 4000 BC, around the same time, that is, as the first known Naqadan communities were established in the south. And just as their southern cousins had inherited a great deal of the earlier Badarian culture, so too the Mahdians and other northern settlements of the time were the inheritors of the culture of Merimda and the Wadi Hof. And all of them, of course, were groups of native Nile-side farmers, who had employed, as the settlement grinding stones and grain bins show, what had already become the standard set of Nile-side farming technologies in stock. One archaeological report, indeed, described the organic residues of a Mahdian settlement as representing that typical Egyptian combination of emmer, barley, acacia and tamarisk. Another observed that the only difference between the economy of prehistoric Mahdi and that of mid-20th century Egyptian peasants was that the Mahdians had enjoyed pigs and soft-shelled Nile turtles, and lacked the relatively modern blessings of water buffalo and camels. Although the contents of their graves and houses show that the Mahdians' farming methods were similar to those of the early Naqadans, a close examination of the variety of bones found in their settlements suggests that they lived quieter lives, hunting less and farming and fishing rather more. At the same time too, the goods left in Mahdian graves are far fewer and much less refined than those of their Naqadan contemporaries. As if to acknowledge this lack of finesse, the Mahdi potters occasionally imitated the southern wares. Their most distinctive products, however, and found in graves and settlements all up and down the Nile Valley, were pretty little vases made of basalt, a hard black volcanic stone found in impressive desert outcrops by the Faiyum and close. Therefore, to the Mahdian heartlands, the Mahdi potters also favored the same color. A robust jet black ware, indeed, has become their archaeological signature. Though lacking the material refinement of the southerners, the Mahdians were also far less isolated. In parts of the main settlement, indeed, set right next to some typically Nilotic rounded huts and grain bins, archaeologists have excavated the remains of large and obviously foreign dwellings with rounded corners and field stone walls. Although unique within the Nile Valley and currently the oldest known stone buildings in all of Egypt, these distinctive structures have been common in the South Levant for several millennia. A great deal of Levantine pottery was also found at Mahdi, large, globular vessels whose practical wavy handles have been taken up and adapted by the Naqadan potters, flat-bottomed wares with cylindrical necks and two distinctive handles such as the potters of the Nile Valley would never make, and jugs whose attenuated spouts were derived from some of the traditional forms of the Jazira in Mesopotamia, and just as they copied the shapes and decorations of the southern craftsmen, so Mahdi's potters also copied the forms of many of these northern importations, and copied so many of them and so frequently, indeed, that their excavators came to consider the culture of the settlement at Mahdi as being closer to the cultures of the Levant than that of the Naqadans in the south. Most of these foreign pots had probably served as containers for imported goods. Just as the Mahdians imported pottery and ostrich feathers, leopard skins, and ivory from the Upper Nile, so too in all probability they imported a range of agricultural products developed in areas to the north and east. In Anatolia and the Jazira, farmers had already extended the range of the basic Neolithic economy, cultivating almonds and fruit trees and breeding sheep for wool and goats for milk and cheese. Olives and vines were also being cultivated as far south as modern Jordan, so these Himalayan juices, too, slopping in their rounded, wavy-handled jars, probably found their way in caravans down into the valley of the Nile. Little survives of all this, however, besides the carrying pots themselves. Some solid lumps of northern bitumen, a few basalt bowls whose flaring rims show them to have been products of Levantine workshops, and quantities of foreign flint, some part worked, which would have rendered them lighter and more compact to transport. Napped in the forms of blades and scrapers, these are typical of the workmanship of the settlements of the South Levant, where further examples have been found in considerable quantities, stacked and wrapped, apparently for shipping. That these foreign flints are the genuine remnants of an extensive supply network is further suggested by the archaeologist's discovery at Madi of large numbers of sharp pectoral bones of Nile catfish, which, when mounted on a reed, make excellent light arrowheads. Though not themselves great hunters, the Madians gathered and conserved these remarkable barbed bones in special storage jars, excavated in settlements and caravan stations in the South Levant. Quantities of this characteristic Nilotic commodity confirms at least a part of the Madians' intended markets. Though sparse, the relics of this traffic in the South Levant are surprisingly wide-ranging. Pots made from Nile clays have been recovered in various Israeli and Jordanian excavations, along with a few cosmetic palettes of Upper Egyptian siltstone, some shells of the Nile's freshwater mussels whose mother-of-pearl was used by Levantine jewelers, 2 grim mace heads that may have originated as far south as the Sudan, and a fragment of a Madian stone jar found by the shore of the Dead Sea, excavated both in the South Levant and at Madi. The bones of donkeys and asses suggest the means by which such traffic flowed, the scant remains of caravan stations that skirt the biblical wastelands of the Sinai and run along the coastal margins from the Nile Delta and up the Mediterranean's eastern coastline map out their routes. Naqada, Levantine and Madian pottery have all been found in many of these small desert stations, along with some spiky Nile catfish bones. It would be entirely false, however, to imagine that this is evidence of mercantile traffic between Egypt and the Levant. There is no evidence of commercial trading in this prehistoric world, nor indeed, are there any indications at this time of such geopolitical distinctions as Egypt or the Levant. Recent surveys in the Nile Delta, moreover, where some 20 settlements have been located with similar Levantine connections to those of Madi, show that they too had more in common with the communities of the South Levant, to whom they were in closer geographical proximity, than with the people of the Naqada heartlands. Here, then, such terms as Egypt clearly have scant relevance. The largest and the best known of these delta communities was set close to the Mediterranean, on an eastern branch of the divided Nile. In pharaonic times, this venerable site would be celebrated as the holy city of Buto, a fabled capital of Lower Egypt whose gods were linked with those of Hierakonpolis. In archaeology, that same name now part provides the modern name of the common culture of these prehistoric northern sites, which are known as the Madi Buto culture, for Buto, in common with others of these delta sites, continued to flourish long after the settlement at Madi was abandoned. Buto's remarkable prehistory was first investigated in the 1980s by an expedition from the German Archaeological Institute, using rows of continuously operating pumps to keep their excavation from filling up with groundwater. And here again, just as at Madi, relics were recovered of a culture that had been closer to that of the South Levant than to that of the Naqadans, as well as the traditional northern forms. Buto's prehistoric potters had also made a range of southern Levantine wares, for which, as the surviving sherds still clearly show, they employed a spinning horizontal stand of Levantine design. This enabled them to refine the shape of their rough and part-dried wares before they were put into the kiln. Of themselves, these little spinning platforms were a significant importation, speeded by the kick of a potter's foot on a weight set on its elongated axle. Such platforms would eventually be made to spin fast enough to permit a craftsman to produce a pot by throwing a ball of white clay down onto its center, then shaping the spinning lump with the heels and fingers of the hands to form a finished pot. This innovation would enable ancient Egyptian potters to work at great speeds and to mass-produce a range of standard wares in considerable quantities. These nondescript fragments of early Buto, whose markings bear witness to the use of a spinning platform within the earliest known settlement, the first known evidence of a potter's wheel in Africa, underline the significance of the continuing traffic in techniques and technologies that had long been entering the valley of the Nile from the Levant. A more vital element in this secondary wave of Levantine importations was that of smelted copper. Unlike tools of flint, which were the only contemporary alternative, copper utensils permitted an extraordinary accuracy of craftsmanship, a precision that would always be a preoccupation of ancient Nile Valley craftsmen. It was copper tools that shaped the stones of pharaohs' pyramids, those near-perfect monuments whose construction shaped the very order of the later state. And even in the centuries before the age of Pharaoh, that same red shining metal had provided the means of building another fundamental element of pharaonic Egypt, those wooden, high-prowed sailing boats that had been drawn within the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis. The sources of the first copper that was used in the Nile Valley are difficult to trace. Like gold and silver, the metal was constantly retrieved, resmelted and reused through the ages. A few unplundered graves, however, testify that the earliest Nile farmers had used small amounts of copper for pins and bodkins, fish hooks and the like, and even modest bits of jewelry, but, as no smelting furnace from those times has yet been found, it is likely that those little things were hammered out from naturally occurring nuggets of the metal collected by herders in the hills of the eastern desert, between the Red Sea and the Nile. At the Mahdi settlement this situation was transformed. Along with considerable quantities of copper ore, some sheet metal and some finished, if heavily corroded, copper tools, 3 cast copper ingots were found inside a single Mahdian house. Mahdi had been so rich in copper, indeed, that archaeologists found the earthen floors of many of its huts stained green with the verdigris of corroded and now largely vanished copper implements. Given the absence within the settlement of common axes made of flint and the rarity of the small flint blades which had long been used as the cutting edge of sickles, we may assume that, by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, within the settlement at Mahdi, tools of copper had replaced most of the traditional tools of flint and bone. The mines that were supplying the Mahdians with such large amounts of copper appear to have been situated in the Sinai and the desert valleys of its eastern fringes, which run down into the Wadi Araba and the Gulf of Aqaba. These, at least, are the source of the ore from which the 3 Mahdi ingots were cast, 2 as rectangular bars and the third in the form of a flat-topped bun, which appears to have been left to harden within its little casting crucible. Though of diverse shape, each of these 3 pieces weighed some 30 ounces, which, if more than a coincidence, would represent the oldest known example of a fundamental element of commercial trading, a basic standard unit. Copper ores had been mined and smelted in the Jizira, in western Persia and in Anatolia, long before the technology was taken up in Sinai in the south Levant, and each of these areas had developed their own forms of copper tools, which had been trafficked far and wide. Not surprisingly, however, the shapes of the first copper implements found in Nile-side settlements are similar to those developed in the Levant, though, once again, the fact that the settlements of Mahdi and early Buto shared a common culture with contemporary communities of the South Levant makes the notion of some kind of foreign trade quite inappropriate. Just as it would be in the time of Pharaoh, prehistoric copper was smelted on the scale of a cottage industry. It was hard and poisonous work, often situated in deserts close to naturally occurring seams of copper ore. Levantine furnaces were prepared by digging simple pits some 2 feet deep, which were then lined with clay and filled with charcoal, wood and copper ore. After this mix was set alight, blasts from leather bellows piped air down into a rounded crucible set at the bottom of the furnace, which would then heat its contents to temperatures of over 1000 degrees Celsius, reducing them to a toxic soup of slag and copper. Being the heavier of the two, the liquid copper would trickle to the bottom of the crucible, where it was tapped by breaking down one side of the furnace pit and allowing the liquid metal to run down into little trenches, where it would harden into ingots. Though only a few Naqada and copper tools are known to have survived from the mid-4th millennium BC, their effect on their communities is plain to see. Before they were available, carpenters had worked such local woods as tamarisk, acacia and Egyptian sycamore, with flint-bladed tools, though extremely sharp. Such flints, as the surviving marks still show, tended to cut the wood in gouges, which allowed but little fine control and encouraged their use in the manner of an adze or spoke shave working a trunk or branch. Around 3500 BC, however, the first known chisels and saws of copper appear in graves within the Naqada heartlands, and at the same time, too, fragments of contemporary surviving woodwork, furniture, boxes and simple coffins, show a use of deep and well-made mortise and tenon joints, woodworking that requires levels of control and accuracy entirely unattainable with tools of flint. Such fine-made furniture also shows that a process of standardization had been adopted in which tree trunks and branches had been squared into planks and beams with saws before they were employed as elements of furniture. These carpenters, therefore, were already using a range of copper tools. So, indeed, were the shipwrights of the day, as the paintings and drawings of the Naqadans suggest, and as the surviving elements of later ancient Nile boats still testify. These vessels appear to have been built in an idiosyncratic manner, which required the large-scale production of planks and beams from the individual and often twisted wood of trees that had grown in the soft silt of the lower Nile. These were then carefully fitted one to another to make up the smoothly distinctive outline of the swinging hull. Those powerful images of boats, therefore, that appear in the middle of the 4th millennium BC testify not only to a contemporary delight in fine-made barks, the Ferraris of their day, but also to the introduction of the new tools and their associated technologies that had enabled their construction. This new river traffic would have required copious and constant supplies of copper, both for maintenance and for its continuing construction. It is not surprising, then, that though Sinai and the South Levant would remain a major source of Egyptian copper down to Roman times, the Naqadans appear to have started mining seams of copper ore in the desert hills to the east of their great river, where their forefathers had collected naturally occurring nuggets of the shining metal and had hammered them into little beads and pins. No one knows the routes by which smelted copper was first imported into the Naqadan heartlands, nor even the century in which it was first introduced. Nor is there any evidence of the voyages the Naqadans themselves may have undertaken for its continued procurement. Did those great wooden vessels carry captains and commanders, priests and merchants? Could they have sailed on the open sea? The delta port of Abydos was open to both the Nile and the Mediterranean, and the contemporary Levantine ports of Byblus and Ugarit were only a few days sailing with the prevailing winds, east and northwards, along the eastern seaboard. The Naqadans may also have sailed, as the pharaonic Egyptians would later do, from ports along the Red Sea coast. The unique construction of similarly shaped wooden boats made in the times of the first Egyptian kings shows that such craft were easily disassembled, so the Naqadans might well have carried the boat's various components, piece by piece, 100 miles and more along the desert wadis, up and away from the Nile-side settlements to the Red Sea coast, where traces of ancient anchorages and ports have recently been found, along with the planks and rigging of similar boats of later ages. The presence of such caravans walking the distant wadis of the eastern deserts, transporting planks and ropes, masts and keelsons, would certainly explain the numerous and often splendid pictures of Naqadan barks that are engraved on some of their rocks, as well as offering a short if somewhat treacherous passage eastwards to the Gulf of Aqaba, to the Sinai coast and the nearby copper mines. Such ancient Red Sea anchorages could also have provided access to Aden in Ethiopia, to the Isle of Dilmun in the Persian Gulf, and to the cities of southern Mesopotamia, and even to the Indies. Here, though, we have dropped off the edge of present knowledge, for we have no information whatever about Naqadan seafaring, and thus we sail entirely on the seas of our imagination. All that the surviving facts can truly demonstrate is that by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, fresh waves of external influence that would be vital for the creation of the pharaonic state were already washing through the cultures of the Lower Nile. 8. Rolling along of men and monsters, 3500 to 3000 BC. At the same time that copper ingots were first imported into the Nile Valley, some small stone engravings of Mesopotamian origin were also entering Naqadan workshops, whose effect upon Egyptian history would be as fundamental as that of smelted copper. Tiny figures, cut on quite modest objects, that served to provide an entirely new dimension to the Naqadan crafts, enabled the workshops to create the images which would define the office of the pharaoh, and lead, eventually, to the invention of a system of images that would record the sound of words. This, then, is where Egypt's written history finds its true origins. During the entire Naqadan period, and this in a region which had previously sustained a diversity of cultures, the dominant culture in Mesopotamia was one that is now named after a celebrated ancient settlement in South Iraq known as the city of Uruk. Like the contemporary though far smaller settlements along the Lower Nile, the period of this so-called Uruk culture was one of communities of farmers who supported groups of people who specialized in separate and single tasks. It was a time, as well, of population movement and enlargement. At the time that the painted tomb was built at Hierakonpolis, settlements of the Uruk culture had already been established in regions well to the north of the Mesopotamian heartlands, up along the tributaries of the Tigris and Euphrates, westwards into the highlands of Syria and Anatolia and eastwards into southwestern Iran, often built beside less ordered and much older indigenous communities. Some of these new-made settlements had high walls around them, and large distinctive buildings at their centers in which archaeologists have found considerable quantities of standard-sized pottery dishes that seem to have been used as grain measures. Tokens, too, little balls and cones of clay, similar to those the Mesopotamians had long used for counting and registering goods and chattels, are also found in these settlements, along with examples of the small engraved seal stones the Mesopotamians used for stamping soft clay with an individual mark, similar in their size to those used until quite recently in Europe. For impressing sealing wax, these seals were used by the people of Uruk, in conjunction with wet clay and knotted cords, for sealing everything from house doors to the lids of storage jars. A millennial craft tradition in the settlements of Mesopotamia and the Zagros Mountains. By the time their influence was felt in Egypt, the Uruk seal engravers were employing a remarkably sophisticated range of imagery and design. By that time, too, the form of the simple stamp seal had been largely superseded by another type in the shape of a small stone cylinder which, when rolled across a bed of soft clay, produced a linear impression, a tiny pattern strip. Small, strong and often very handsome, for many of them were cut from semi-precious stones and highly polished. Such seals were a perfect medium for transporting Mesopotamian imagery throughout the ancient world. In the valley of the Nile, their impact is most obvious in the thousands of seal impressions that have been found in Naqadan cemeteries. Though they are mostly the products of seals made by local craftsmen, they show that the Naqadans took up the art of seal cutting for themselves and in the process absorbed some of the styles, designs and images developed in Uruk. Ultimately, of course, proof of such influence rests in the eye of the beholder. For the serendipity of preservation and retrieval allows little chance of finding a seal at a Naqadan site that can be proven to have been made by an Uruk craftsman and to have had specific influence upon an object of Naqadan manufacture. The chances are so very low indeed that the employment of such criteria when dealing with the fragmented relics of this vague age serves only to deny the obvious. The impact of the Uruk designs on the crafts of the Naqadans is plain enough to see because Naqadan seals are composed and drawn in ways that are completely different to those of the traditional crafts of the Lower Nile. And their imagery, too, is entirely alien. A prime example of the intrusion of Uruk into the valley of the Nile is the image of a nightmarish figure drawn full face with arms akimbo, with stars for its head and hands and two more stars projecting from its midriff. The first known appearance of this bizarre concoction comes from a grave at Abydos, a tiny image of the starry figure set amidst three lines of animals produced by the rolling impression of an Uruk-style Naqadan seal. In another grave, 250 miles north of Abydos, Petrie excavated a careful reproduction of the selfsame monster, enlarged to the size of an open hand and engraved on one face of a Naqadan cosmetic palette of a slightly later date. No other palettes are known to have pictured this idiosyncratic image, which is way outside all earlier Naqadan design conventions. For its accommodation, the palette's craftsmen had to adapt the four monsters' windmill arms to frame an area where cosmetic pigments could be ground. Here, then, an Uruk image was adapted to traditional Naqadan purposes, at the same time that copper ingots were first imported into the Nile Valley. Some small stone engravings of Mesopotamian origin were also entering Naqadan workshops, whose effect upon Egyptian history would be as fundamental as that of smelted copper. Tiny figures, cut on quite modest objects, that served to provide an entirely new dimension to the Naqadan crafts, enabled the workshops to create the images which would define the office of the pharaoh, and lead, eventually, to the invention of a system of images that would record the sound of words. This, then, is where Egypt's written history finds its true origins. During the entire Naqadan period, and this in a region which had previously sustained a diversity of cultures, the dominant culture in Mesopotamia was one that is now named after a celebrated ancient settlement in South Iraq known as the city of Uruk. Like the contemporary though far smaller settlements along the Lower Nile, the period of this so-called Uruk culture was one of communities of farmers who supported groups of people who specialized in separate and single tasks. It was a time, as well, of population movement and enlargement. At the time that the painted tomb was built at Hierakonpolis, settlements of the Uruk culture had already been established in regions well to the north of the Mesopotamian heartlands, up along the tributaries of the Tigris and Euphrates, westwards into the highlands of Syria and Anatolia and eastwards into southwestern Iran, often built beside less ordered and much older indigenous communities. Some of these new-made settlements had high walls around them, and large distinctive buildings at their centers in which archaeologists have found considerable quantities of standard-sized pottery dishes that seem to have been used as grain measures. Tokens, too, little balls and cones of clay, similar to those the Mesopotamians had long used for counting and registering goods and chattels, are also found in these settlements, along with examples of the small engraved seal stones the Mesopotamians used for stamping soft clay with an individual mark, similar in their size to those used until quite recently in Europe. For impressing sealing wax, these seals were used by the people of Uruk, in conjunction with wet clay and knotted cords, for sealing everything from house doors to the lids of storage jars. A millennial craft tradition in the settlements of Mesopotamia and the Zagros Mountains. By the time their influence was felt in Egypt, the Uruk seal engravers were employing a remarkably sophisticated range of imagery and design. By that time, too, the form of the simple stamp seal had been largely superseded by another type in the shape of a small stone cylinder which, when rolled across a bed of soft clay, produced a linear impression, a tiny pattern strip. Small, strong and often very handsome, for many of them were cut from semi-precious stones and highly polished. Such seals were a perfect medium for transporting Mesopotamian imagery throughout the ancient world. In the valley of the Nile, their impact is most obvious in the thousands of seal impressions that have been found in Naqadan cemeteries. Though they are mostly the products of seals made by local craftsmen, they show that the Naqadans took up the art of seal cutting for themselves and in the process absorbed some of the styles, designs and images developed in Uruk. Ultimately, of course, proof of such influence rests in the eye of the beholder. For the serendipity of preservation and retrieval allows little chance of finding a seal at a Naqadan site that can be proven to have been made by an Uruk craftsmen to have had specific influence upon an object of Naqadan manufacture. The chances are so very low indeed that the employment of such criteria when dealing with the fragmented relics of this vague age serves only to deny the obvious. The impact of the Uruk designs on the crafts of the Naqadans is plain enough to see because Naqadan seals are composed and drawn in ways that are completely different to those of the traditional crafts of the Lower Nile. And their imagery, too, is entirely alien. A prime example of the intrusion of Uruk into the valley of the Nile is the image of a nightmarish figure drawn full face with arms akimbo, with stars for its head and hands and two more stars projecting from its midriff. The first known appearance of this bizarre concoction comes from a grave at Abydos, a tiny image of the starry figure set amidst three lines of animals produced by the rolling impression of an Uruk-style Naqadan seal. In another grave, 250 miles north of Abydos, Petrie excavated a careful reproduction of the selfsame monster, enlarged to the size of an open hand and engraved on one face of a Naqadan cosmetic palette of a slightly later date. No other palettes are known to have pictured this idiosyncratic image, which is way outside all earlier Naqadan design conventions. For its accommodation, the palette's craftsmen had to adapt the four monsters' windmill arms to frame an area where cosmetic pigments could be ground. Here, then, an Uruk image was adapted to traditional Naqadan purposes,